Hello and welcome to this talk in which I discuss in detail an image of mine, including its content, context, and aspects of its making. More details can be found in the video description below. So the image I'm discussing today is part of this compilation, which is called Call and Response, and this is a 30-year retrospective produced about 10 years ago that looked at the sort of first half of my life then, working life as a photographer then. And this image is this one in particular, this is the one we're discussing today, and I'll have an insert as I normally would do. The caption which reads, Amy Madlau Low left, chatting to her neighbor and friend Makau Khumalo, Ivuna, KwaZulu-Natal, 1988. So Amy Madlau Low, disclaimer, was my grandmother, and who I ended up photographing for the last 25 years of her life, pretty much. The cabinet you see behind me is from her home, and so is this wonderful piece of hand-carved bowl, which was from her kitchen, from her home, and which she gave to me while she was still alive because it was damaged and she had stopped using it. But it's a treasured piece of in my home today. The image that you're looking at, just to talk about the content, you see Amy sitting, talking to her neighbor and friend, Makadi. And these were people who were now quite elderly and had lived most of their lives together. You know, they had shared a history probably of easily 50 years when the image was made. And they were neighbors. It turned out that I discovered after this image that Makwabi had once been, had in fact come there as somebody who worked for Amy, my grandmother, and her husbands. She married two brothers, one after the other, obviously, and was a successful peasant farmer in the region, and so employed people, and in that informal way that people came and lived in the vicinity and coexisted. So the context in which you see her, that's a back room of Amy's home that she built herself with her own hands after she was moved from a stone house, also fairly humble, but a stone-built house, much more solid and closer to the confluence of two rivers, the Ivuna River and the White Mfolozi River, which is about 5 kilometers away from where this one was located. And so I came to photograph Amy quite consciously, but not excessively. But, you know, whenever I got an opportunity to visit, I would consciously explore her life, because as a young man, I was about 31 years old when I made this image. As a young man in my 20s, mid 20s, late 20s, conscious, becoming politically conscious, and I discovered her as a very interesting figure, because she fell outside of the racial separation that was the order of the day in the 70s and 80s and 60s, back then, of the logical consequence of apartheid, the separate ideology of separation. She resisted that. She lived outside of that of that dictate, and lived amongst black people, which was a rare sight back in those days, but a normal thing to do in a normal society. So it intrigued me, and it gave me an opportunity to look at what could have been had we not been subjected to this social experiment of apartheid. And an interesting thing about this particular image is, for instance, that I never ever saw Maqwabi seated. She would not have sat on that couch or another chair in that house, either next to her friend and neighbor and previous master, or even across from her. And I learned that that was an etiquette thing, of Zulu etiquette thing, of that class divide. So that class existed among Zulu people. An interesting thing I'd like to hear from others who have studied it, to see if that certainly with royalty there was a class divide, you know. So I think that there was elements of class. But there was a deep connection. My grandmother had friends, and these Maqwabi had certainly become her friend as well, and confidant, and assistant him still in many ways as she became infirm in her old age. She lived there until she was 100 years old and died at 103. And I subsequently learned, this, as I said, this image, this is part of a body of work called Blood Relatives, in which I also made a video documentary, and I'll try to put a link to that documentary as well in this. Hopefully it will be accessible. But it's also, I've also subsequently begun recently another project with an academic who looks at imaging, photography in particular, and you know, using it as a investigating our histories and aspects of who we are through images. And the project will be, its working title is Madlao, which was Amy Lowe's Zulu colloquial name, the colloquial name that she was known by. I discovered through this academic that there has not been another such project where a black woman has been photographed for such an extended length of time. And this was a simple peasant woman, really, which I think makes it interesting, equally interesting, in that, you know, she wasn't photographed simply because she was some sort of, you know, personality or well-known personality. Amy Madlao was certainly well-known where she lived, and a formidable woman in many different ways. Too many to count in this that will come through in that project, I suppose. So I'll be discussing other images of her life, because I produced quite a few that were, you know, quite striking, perhaps even iconic. I've spoken already earlier about an image that I made in her kitchen that is quite archaeological in some ways, and sociological. It has layers, and it reveals aspects of who she was, as I suppose kitchens do, you know. Yeah, this very simple, poignant image that, you know, has pretty good composition qualities. The light, you know, works. These are the things that help make an image compelling and want you to stay and dwell on it, and make sense, make meaning. And I suppose that's the importance of images, that they do that for us. They help us make meaning of our world. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you with the next